Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we don't sip the corporate version. We drink straight from the source, raw, bitter, and bubbling over with the parts your textbooks love to leave out. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're heading to the sticky streets of Reconstruction-era Georgia, a place of pain, powder, and potions. Because tonight's story isn't about a soda, it's about a man who brewed a cure for his own demons. And in doing so, built the foundation of a global empire that still tastes like America. His name? John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist, a Civil War veteran, an addict, a tinkerer, the wounded soul who gave us Coca-Cola, or at least the prototype. But don't imagine boardrooms and polar bears just yet. This was a man who stirred cocaine and caffeine together in a battered kettle and sold it to desperate men with headaches and hangovers. So pour yourself a glass, or better yet, a shot of something stronger, because we're about to crack open the story of John Stith Pemberton and the pain that fizzed up into the world's best-selling sweetness. Long before the syrupy sweetness of Coca-Cola touched the lips of the world, it simmered in the restless mind of a sickly boy with an eye for powders and potions. John Stith Pemberton was born in 1831 in Knoxville, Georgia, a state where the air was thick with heat. The cotton fields stretched to the horizon, and the future for most boys was more likely to be found behind a plow than behind a pharmacist's counter. But John was not most boys. From an early age, he was restless, bright, and drawn to the strange alchemy of medicine. In an age when doctors bled patients with leeches and mixed mercury into cures, the world of chemistry was half science, half sorcery, and Pemberton wanted in. His family saw his curiosity and did what they could to encourage it. He pored over the handful of medical texts his family could afford. He tinkered with herbs, minerals, and homemade tonics. While other boys snuck sips of moonshine behind the barn, John sniffed the sharp, acrid fumes of his makeshift brews and dreamed of making something new, something that might change a man's body, or at least dull his pain. In his teens, he apprenticed at a local apothecary. Back then, a druggist's shop was equal parts pharmacy, general store, and rumor mill. It smelled of camphor, licorice, cloves, and strong spirits. Shelves lined with corked glass bottles and dusty jars promised relief from headaches, fevers, melancholy, or heartbreak for the right price. A good pharmacist didn't just know recipes, he knew people's secrets. He knew whose cough was real and whose thirst was deeper than any sickness. Young John took it all in. When he was barely 16, he was already making simple compounds for neighbors. Tinctures for stomach aches, poultices for cuts, soothing syrups to quiet a child's cough in the humid Georgia night. And people noticed. His knack for mixing wasn't just about recipes. It was about curiosity and the confidence to try again when a batch failed. Learning in a new South Georgia in the 1840s was changing fast. Cotton was king. Railroads were beginning to stitch the state together, carrying bales and barrels to the ports and bringing back crates of strange new chemicals, books, and ideas. Pemberton felt that pulse of possibility, a hunger for the new that matched his own. At 19, he scraped together enough money and enough family pride to enroll in the Reformed Medical College of Georgia in Macon. The school's name sounded grander than it was. In reality, it was a tiny, underfunded college where the lines between doctor, pharmacist, and folk healer blurred. But for Pemberton, it was a door cracked open to a wider world. There he learned about the latest discoveries from Europe, the wonders of morphine, chloroform, and ether. He learned how to compound delicate powders and distill potent tinctures. He learned that pain was a constant companion in this rough young nation, and that if you could soothe it, you'd never lack for customers. More than anything, young Pemberton learned this: chemistry was power. In a world without antibiotics, without x-rays or safe surgeries, a man with the right bottle behind the counter could be a savior, a confidant, or a pusher. A dream and a war on the horizon. When John Stith Pemberton graduated with his medical and pharmacy credentials, he was just 20. Georgia on the eve of Civil War was a place where fortunes were made and lost overnight. Cotton planters, merchants, and desperate settlers all wanted quick cures for the fevers and infections that stalked the South's swamps and cities. By his mid-20s, Pemberton had set up his own small drugstore. He was a lean, sharp-eyed man with neat sideburns and ink stains on his fingers from jotting down formula after formula in his leather-bound notebooks. Some customers said he was a little aloof, more comfortable talking about ingredients than gossip. But his potions worked well enough, and his reputation grew. No one knew that the gentle young chemist, so careful with measurements and labels, would one day stir together coca leaves and cola nuts in a battered brass kettle, a mixture that would outlive him by more than a century. For now, all they saw was a boy with stained sleeves, a mind full of possibilities, and a taste for chemistry that would lead him down roads darker and sweeter than he could ever imagine. When the guns of the Civil War cracked open the fields and forests of the South, they didn't spare the careful men behind counters and lab tables. John Stith Pemberton was 30 when the first shots at Fort Sumter roared through the newspapers and streets of Georgia. A pharmacist by trade, a trained doctor by diploma, he could have stayed behind, mixing poultices, setting broken bones, tending to the endless fevers that the swampy South bred like mosquitoes. But that wasn't how it went. Pemberton, like so many young men of the Confederacy, traded his mortar and pestle for a saber and a gray uniform. He joined the 3rd Georgia Cavalry, a volunteer regiment of farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and country boys, all bound by duty to a cause that would shatter the South they were trying to defend. At first, Pemberton's role was partly as a surgeon, partly as a cavalryman. He rode with the others, his saddlebags stuffed not just with rations and ammunition, but with bandages, chloroform, and crude surgical tools. The reality of battlefield medicine was a far cry from the tidy shelves of his drugstore. In a muddy clearing under fire, a doctor's work was raw and hurried. Amputations done by saw in the open air, wounds cleaned with whiskey, if anything at all. Infection was the real enemy, claiming more men than bullets or sabers ever could. In April 1865, as the war dragged toward its bloody close, Pemberton found himself near Columbus, Georgia, one of the last holdouts of the collapsing Confederacy. Union cavalry swept down through the city in what would be called the Battle of Columbus, sometimes claimed as the war's final battle east of the Mississippi. Some accounts say Pemberton was leading a small unit of cavalry. Others say he was tending to the wounded when he found himself in the thick of the fight. What's certain is that in the chaos and gun smoke, John Stith Pemberton took a deep saber slash to his chest. The blade cut him open near the breastbone, a wound that by all logic should have killed him then and there, or left him to rot from infection in a makeshift field hospital. But Pemberton didn't die. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the skill of a fellow surgeon. Maybe it was the very thing he understood best, chemistry, that kept him alive. Morphine was the wonder drug of the Civil War, a new, miraculous substance that dulled pain so a man could survive the saw and the bullet. Pemberton knew it well, and soon he needed it not just for his patients, but for himself. A new battle and a new addiction. Pemberton limped home to Georgia a broken man in more ways than one. The wound never fully healed. He carried its pain in his ribs and shoulder for the rest of his life. He returned to a state that was itself wounded. Towns burned, plantations in ruin, an economy smashed under the heel of Union victory. Like so many Confederate veterans, Pemberton brought back more than scars. He brought back a new hunger. Morphine had been a miracle on the battlefield. At home, it was a curse disguised as comfort. The pain in his chest flared every morning, a deep, gnawing throb that no herbal poultice could touch. The only thing that could quiet it was a needle or a draught of bitter fluid. At first, he told himself he could control it. After all, he was no common drunk. He was a doctor, a chemist. If anyone could master morphine, surely it was him. But addiction didn't care about diplomas or good intentions. It crept into his routine like poison in the bloodstream. One dose to sleep, one to quiet the ache so he could work, one more to chase off the tremors in his hands. And still, John Stith Pemberton had to keep the lights on. The Reconstruction South was no place for the weak. His drugstore shelves were stocked with tonics and powders for every human complaint. But behind the counter, he was already working on something new. He needed a cure for pain, his own and the South's, something stronger than coffee, more respectable than whiskey, more marketable than a bottle labeled morphine. The Pemberton's war wound did something else to him, too. It gave him a reason to experiment, to tinker late into the humid nights of post-war Georgia. He read medical journals out of Europe. He pored over reports of exotic plants, the stimulating coca leaf from South America, the bitter cola nut from Africa. He mixed, he boiled, he tasted. He took one addiction and tried to drown it with another. This wasn't yet Coca-Cola, but the seed was there, swirling in a battered copper kettle behind the drugstore counter, fueled by one man's stubborn refusal to lie down and let pain win. So next time you see that bright red can, remember, before it was sweetness, it was survival. Before it was a logo, but it was the battlefield echoing in the ribs of a wounded veteran, desperate for relief and willing to drink any cure he could invent. Back in the dim gaslight of his pharmacy, John Stith Pemberton fought two enemies at once: the pain that gnawed at his ribs each morning and the silent, needling hunger that whispered for more morphine each night. By the 1870s, the South was limping along in Reconstruction's fragile dawn, and so was he. A once proud cavalryman turned pharmacist turned captive to a bottle and a syringe. But if Pemberton's body was failing him, his mind was as restless as ever. In the New South, ruined planters, tired shopkeepers, and factory workers stumbled in and out of druggists' doors, looking for relief from everything from malaria and headaches to heartbreak and hangovers. This was an age before the FDA, before warning labels, before safe doses. The back room of any decent pharmacy was a laboratory, and Pemberton's mind was always whirring with recipes. In the late 19th century, one ingredient was all the rage among adventurous pharmacists: coca. The dried leaves of the South American coca plant had been used for centuries by the Andean people, who chewed it to stave off hunger and exhaustion in the thin mountain air. But to European chemists, and now American ones, coca promised something more: a new exotic stimulant to chase away fatigue and dullness. Chemists had begun isolating cocaine from those leaves, praising its power to numb pain and invigorate the senses. To Pemberton, bruised veteran, wounded healer, cunning businessman, coca looked like salvation. The birth of French wine coca. So sometime around 1885, in his modest lab in Columbus, Georgia, Pemberton did what he'd done since boyhood. He mixed, he boiled, he stirred. He combined coca leaves with another rising star of Southern potions, the cola nut, prized for its high caffeine content and its tangy, bitter edge. To bind it together, he borrowed an idea sweeping Europe and America's big cities: coca wine. A Parisian chemist named Angelo Mariani had made a fortune bottling Vin Mariani, Bordeaux wine laced with coca extract, endorsed by everyone from Thomas Edison to Pope Leo XIII. Pemberton, ever the tinkerer, created his own local spin: Pemberton's French wine coca. He advertised it boldly: a brain tonic, a nerve tonic, a cure for headaches, melancholy, and of course, morphine addiction. This last claim was a twisted irony. Pemberton was selling a new stimulant to help folks kick an old one, a man selling the same desperate hope to strangers that he was mixing up for himself behind closed doors. He claimed his potion could lift the blues, steady trembling hands, and restore vital forces. And for some customers, it did, at least until the next bottle ran out. Selling a cure and feeding a habit. Pemberton wasn't alone in these narcotic experiments. Atlanta and other southern cities were full of competing wine tonics and nerve elixirs. But Pemberton's marketing genius and his genuine pharmacist's skill gave his product an edge. He advertised relentlessly in newspapers and medical journals, boasting endorsements from local doctors and high society customers. At his pharmacy, customers watched him mix the batches himself, stirring coca leaves and cola extract into a blend of wine and secret herbs. It was the promise of modern science in a glass. For the weary merchant or the overworked laborer, a swig of Pemberton's French wine coca was a jolt of warmth and clarity in an age that offered precious little of either. And for Pemberton himself, his potion became his crutch, a gentler companion to the morphine needle he could never quite set aside. He drank it daily to steady his hands. He touted it to others as a miracle for neurasthenia, that catch-all 19th century diagnosis for any sadness, fatigue, or vague sense that life was heavier than one could bear. If anyone knew that feeling, it was John Stith Pemberton. But the South was changing again. This time in ways Pemberton couldn't control. In Atlanta, the growing temperance movement declared war on alcohol. By 1886, Fulton County had enacted a dry law banning the sale of wine and spirits. For Pemberton's French wine coca, the name alone was now poison. A wine-based tonic in a dry county couldn't flow over the counter, no matter how many vital forces it promised to restore. Faced with the sudden threat to his best-selling potion, Pemberton did what he always did when cornered. He tinkered. He poured off the wine, swapped in sweet syrup and sugar to mask the harsh bite of Coca and Cola. He kept the extract potent but made it sparkle with carbonated water, a refreshing novelty that made people feel like they were sipping something new, something fun, something more than a medicine. Without quite knowing it, the wounded Confederate pharmacist with his battered kettle and his lifelong ache had stumbled into something bigger than any tonic he'd ever brewed. A new idea was fizzing in his beakers and barrels, an idea that would survive him, outgrow him, and one day become the red and white swirl that circles the globe. But for now, it was still just another experiment, another patch on an old wound that never really healed. The birth of Coca-Cola, Etla 1886. A city with the sting of gunpowder still lingering in its memory, its scorched streets patched over with new storefronts and bold dreams. Railroads rattled through the crossroads carrying cotton and coal, carrying whispers of industry and the promise that the South, battered and bruised, might yet rise again, not through plantations, but through commerce, trade, and chemistry. And there, behind the dusty windows of a modest brick pharmacy on Marietta Street, stood John Stith Pemberton. Civil War veteran, morphine addict, local druggist turned restless inventor, squinting at bubbling beakers and stained notebooks. In his hands was a final gamble. The temperance laws had choked off the lifeblood of his French wine coca. The wine was out, the moral crusaders were in, and if Pemberton wanted to keep selling his miracle potion, he needed to make it respectable, refreshing, and dry as a Baptist picnic. So he did what he'd always done. He tinkered. He boiled and strained, swapped wine for sugar syrup, added a dash of essential oils, spices, and citric acid to round the bitterness. The cola nut still gave its sharp, caffeinated punch. The coca leaf extract still lent its subtle stimulant buzz. But now there was no wine to scandalize Atlanta's growing legion of prohibitionists. The final flourish? Carbonated water. At the time, soda fountains were a bright new novelty sweeping American drugstores. They promised more than just sweetness. They were advertised as healthful, a modern fizz that could calm the stomach, quench a thirst, and deliver medicinal tonics, with a little sparkle to make the medicine go down. For a people weary from war and the harsh cure of Reconstruction, a sweet, bubbling sip at the marble soda counter felt like a small taste of progress. A name, a partner, and a fountain. Pemberton's partner in this final transformation was a bookkeeper named Frank Mason Robinson, a shrewd young man with an eye for branding. It was Robinson who scribbled the new name in his precise, flowing script. Coca-Cola. He thought the two C's looked good together in print. It sounded modern yet exotic, promising the wonder of distant plants with a dash of clean American wholesomeness. Pemberton sold his new temperance drink at Jacob's Pharmacy, one of Atlanta's busiest apothecaries, where soda jerks clinked glasses and board clerks mixed flavored syrups into seltzer for a few cents a glass. The very first glass of Coca-Cola was poured on May 8th, 1886, a brownish, sweet, slightly medicinal concoction poured over ice, the bubbles crackling in the Georgia heat. The price? 5 cents a glass, a nickel to chase away a headache, a nickel to cool down in the stifling Atlanta sun, a nickel to sip at the marble counter and feel, if only for a moment, that the future might be a little sweeter than the past. Coca-Cola was just another curiosity in a city of quack remedies and miracle syrups. Sales crawled along, maybe a few glasses a day. But for those who drank it, something stuck. It was crisp, slightly spicy, a hint of the exotic. Robinson threw himself into local ads, daubing delicious, refreshing onto signs and pushing the idea that Coca-Cola was still a brain tonic, a civilized cure for fatigue, headaches, and nervous afflictions. Meanwhile, the man who invented it was drifting further from the bright promise of his own creation. Pemberton's health was failing. The saber wound in his chest throbbed day and night. The morphine he'd once used for battlefield agony was now an unshakable chain, a needle on the nightstand, a secret he could never break free from. He was still mixing batches by hand in an old brass kettle, still trying to refine the taste, but the irony was bitter. He was too weak and too dependent to scale his invention beyond the local fountain. Worse, Pemberton needed money, urgently. Debts piled up. His addiction drained whatever profit dripped in. So he did what desperate inventors so often do. He began selling off shares of his formula to local businessmen. Piece by piece, he traded away control of the very thing that might have saved him. And a vanishing act. In the final months of his life, Pemberton watched others begin to glimpse the empire his bubbling brown syrup might become. He filed a few rough patents, negotiated partial sales to investors who saw bigger things ahead, but his health crumbled faster than his accounts could refill. By 1888, John Stith Pemberton was bedridden, consumed by stomach cancer, and racked by the old saber wound that never healed right. Morphine dulled the pain but blurred the future. His son Charlie, himself addicted, tried to cling to what scraps of the company he could, but the vultures were circling. In August of that year, Pemberton died in Atlanta, poor, addicted, and all but forgotten. His battered notebooks and stained copper kettle outlived him, passing into the hands of the men who would turn his humble soda fountain experiment into a brand stamped on baseball caps and billboards from Atlanta to Africa. So next time you crack open a cold Coke, remember it didn't start in a glass bottle pulled from a fridge. It started in a battered kettle, stirred by a man haunted by war, pain, and a chemist's unbreakable curiosity. Coca-Cola wasn't born corporate. It was born desperate. A last shot at comfort fizzed into the glass of a tired, thirsty South. When John Stith Pemberton died in August 1888, there was no brass band playing, no grand marble mausoleum, no parade of Coca-Cola trucks lined up to salute the wounded chemist who had started it all. He was laid to rest in Columbus, Georgia, a frail man of 57, carried to his grave by the same morphine that once dulled the saber wound in his chest. His son Charlie, who had inherited more of his father's addictions than his talents, clutched what scraps of the Coca-Cola rights he could, but he too was spiraling. Within 3 years, Charlie would be dead at 30, found on a streetcar, a morphine bottle by his side, the Pemberton name buried with him in obscurity. But above ground, the thing John had brewed to soothe his pain, that sweet, brown, bubbling concoction, was stirring to life in a way he never imagined. Enter Asa Candler, the man with the match. While Pemberton lay dying, a sharp-eyed Atlanta druggist named Asa Griggs Candler was watching, listening, and plotting. Candler was no chemist, no inventor, but he was a businessman down to his bone marrow. He saw what Pemberton never could, that this little temperance drink wasn't just another quack tonic for headaches and hangovers. It was a brand waiting to be born. Candler began quietly buying up every scrap of Coca-Cola he could get. Rights here, partial stakes there. He talked to Pemberton's partners, waved cash at Charlie in his fog of addiction. Piece by piece, Candler stitched together total control of the formula, paying just a few $100s in total for something that would soon be worth millions. Pemberton's widow would later swear that John had never really understood what he was selling, that his intention was to hold on to at least half the rights for his family. But by then, the ink was dry, the papers signed, and the empire was no longer Pemberton's to claim. The bottles begin to march. Under Candler's iron grip, Coca-Cola stopped pretending to be a pharmacist's nervous cure and started becoming what it really was: a drink, a pleasure, a refreshment for everyone, not just the sick and weary. Candler slashed the old claims about healing morphine addiction, which was a dark joke anyway, considering the traces of coca still humming in every glass. He focused instead on sweetness and sparkle, on the promise that an icy Coca-Cola was the best thing you could put to your lips on a sweltering Georgia day. He gave away thousands of gallons of syrup to soda fountains just to get people hooked. He sent armies of boys out to plaster the name on barns, fences, and brick walls. The swirling Spencerian script dreamed up by Frank Robinson under Pemberton's nose became one of the most famous logos on Earth. By the turn of the century, the product had leapt from Atlanta soda fountains to every corner drugstore in the South. Then the bottling franchises came, not invented by Candler, but shrewdly allowed to flourish. Entrepreneurs begged for the right to bottle Coca-Cola and sell it outside the soda counter. Candler, ever cautious but not stupid, sold the bottling rights for $1 to two lawyers in Chattanooga, a tiny decision that would open the door to tens of billions of bottles down the road. A recipe for global addiction. By the 1920s, as the roaring decades of jazz and Model Ts took over America, Coca-Cola was unstoppable. The coca leaf's actual cocaine content was discreetly removed, or so they said, by 1929 as the public mood turned against the drug's dangerous glow. But the company kept the leaves, the spent coca, flavoring the drink just enough to cling to its exotic roots. The caffeine stayed, of course. So did the secret blend of oils and spices known only to a handful of company men, locked in a vault tighter than Fort Knox. Advertising became the real secret ingredient. Coca-Cola billboards rose along highways. Painted murals appeared on the side of barns from Alabama to Arizona. By the Second World War, the U.S. government even helped ship Coke to GIs fighting in Europe and the Pacific, calling it a taste of home. Billions of bottles followed the American flag wherever it planted itself, turning a wounded pharmacist's survival potion into a symbol of American life itself, bright, sweet, and fizzy with the promise of endless summer. No monument for Pemberton. Through it all, Pemberton's name faded like an old sign in the Georgia sun. The company liked to hint at its humble roots, sure, but the real story of a morphine addict, a Civil War saber wound, and a kettle of cocaine wine wasn't exactly corporate brochure material. They polished the myth instead. The kindly Southern druggist with a twinkle in his eye who invented the pause that refreshes. Yet, if Pemberton could see it all now, the red cans stacked high on freighters, the neon signs in Bangkok, the trucks rolling through dusty backroads in Africa, the billions spent on ads showing smiling families clinking bottles in perpetual summer. What would he think? Would he taste victory on his tongue, or would he feel that old saber wound again, that same dull ache that no potion ever truly cured? The empire he birthed while trying to ease his own agony now circles the globe like a sugary crown. But the man who brewed the first batch never tasted that wealth. He never saw the polar bears, the Super Bowl ads, the glass bottle glistening with condensation in the hand of a Hollywood star. He just saw the inside of an empty bottle, a needle on a nightstand, and a ledger that never quite balanced. So next time you crack open a Coke, remember, behind that red swirl is a wounded man hunched over a kettle, desperate for relief, and a cunning businessman who knew a thirst when he saw one. If you stand in line at a gas station today, maybe half awake on a Monday, maybe on the road somewhere between big cities and little towns, you'll find it there, humming inside the humming refrigerator, the red swirl, the glass bottle or the can that snaps open with a hiss, a taste that hasn't really changed in over a century, no matter how the world around it did. Every second, somewhere in the world, more than 10,000 Coca-Colas are opened, poured, sipped, or slammed down cold. The company likes to say that more people recognize its logo than the Christian cross. They're not wrong. It's everywhere. Ballparks, border towns, airport lounges, dusty village shops with a single battered cooler humming in the heat. But inside each cold, sweet sip, inside that fizz and burn at the back of your throat, is the ghost of a man few remember. A wounded Confederate cavalryman with a morphine habit, a battered kettle, and a half-mad dream that maybe, just maybe, he could cure himself with chemistry. What Pemberton really made. Pemberton didn't just invent a drink. He built a bridge between two worlds, the raw, unregulated medicine shows of the 19th century and the polished, billion-dollar consumer brands of the 20th. In his time, tonics were medicine. Today, we know them for what they really were. Placebos and stimulants that blurred the line between cure and craving. He never lived to see how his humble brain tonic would morph from a pharmacy curiosity into a daily ritual for steelworkers and secretaries, suburban kids, and global presidents. He never saw the wave of advertising that would teach generation after generation that happiness could be bottled, branded, and sold for a nickel, then $1, then $3. He never saw how Coca-Cola would become both a symbol of freedom and a weapon of capitalism, how it would wrap itself in the stars and stripes, follow GIs into Europe and Asia, and stand for the idea that you, too, could taste a piece of America, no matter where you lived or what language you spoke. A bittersweet shadow. And yet, for all its sparkle and cheer, Coca-Cola's sweetness casts a shadow, one Pemberton would understand all too well. The man who tried to cure his addiction with a new potion ended up laying the foundation for a global craving that never really goes away. Billions of gallons of sweet syrup, billions of pounds of sugar, billions of dollars in profit, and countless debates about cavities, obesity, water rights, plastic waste, and corporate power. It's the modern version of Pemberton's own cycle, relief that costs you later. A quick sip that picks you up, then leaves you wanting more. It's almost poetic in a dark way. He made his potion to soothe an ache he couldn't name, and now that ache hums inside vending machines from Lima to Lagos. More than a drink. Yet to reduce Coca-Cola to just sugar, caffeine, and corporate greed would miss the point, and the strange genius Pemberton stumbled into. Coca-Cola didn't just quench a thirst, it bottled a feeling. A pause. A simple pleasure that felt modern, safe, dependable, and for generations, oddly wholesome. A sip of summer. A fizz of possibility. A clink of ice that says, take a break, you've earned it. Pemberton's battered notebook didn't just brew up syrup. It brewed up something deeper. The dream that chemistry and a dash of marketing could solve pain, loneliness, fatigue, the nagging sense that life should taste a little sweeter than it does. He didn't live to see the beaches full of Coke cans, the smiling Santa ads, the polar bears on primetime TV. He didn't live to see a company so big it could sponsor the Olympics, stamp its logo on rockets, or tangle with governments over water and sugar and labor. He didn't even live to see a single bottle leave Atlanta. But every bottle that leaves a warehouse today still whispers his name, even if it's buried under layers of sugar, fizz, and marketing spin. So next time you crack one open, that glass bottle, that icy can, remember, behind the fizz is a wounded man with a saber scar in his chest, standing in a cramped Georgia pharmacy, hunched over a copper kettle, trying to brew himself a second chance. The legacy in the bottle isn't just sweetness, it's the story that sometimes the thing we create to save ourselves doesn't save us at all. But it might just change the world for everyone else. So next time you see that familiar red swirl on a billboard blazing under the African sun, on a glass bottle dripping condensation in a corner store cooler, on a can clutched by a tired kid at a gas station, remember, it didn't start here. It didn't start with polar bears or Christmas trucks or catchy slogans. It started in the sticky heat of Reconstruction, Georgia, in a battered brass kettle watched over by a hollow-eyed pharmacist who could never quite outrun the ache in his own chest. Remember John Stith Pemberton, not the myth, but the man. The man who stood at the edge of an age where medicine was half snake oil and half salvation, and tried to cure himself by feeding the world a new addiction. A Civil War saber slash gave him pain, chemistry gave him hope, and desperation gave him Coca-Cola. He didn't live to taste the empire it would build. He didn't cash the checks or clink the bottles. But in every fizzing sip, there's a ghost of a man stirring his next experiment, telling himself this time it'll work. This time it'll fix what's broken. The empire rolled on without him. His name faded into the fine print of company lore. Too messy, too human for a corporate fairy tale. But the next time you pause at a vending machine or pop a cap at a ball game, know this. Behind every bottle is a question worth asking. What do we trade for sweetness? Whose pain bubbles up under the stories we're sold? Who pays for the dreams we drink without thinking? Because Faces of History isn't here to hand you the polished version. We're here to pop the hood, stir the kettle, pull the label back until the truth fizzes up and stings your throat a little. We're here to remind you that every brand, every statue, every icon, it all started with a face. A human one. Flawed, hungry, scared, brilliant. Just like yours. Just like mine. So stay curious, stay awake, and the next time you reach for that cold bottle, crack it open and take a second to taste the story too. The story of a wounded veteran who thought he could outrun his pain in a kettle of brown syrup and ended up bottling a century instead. I'm the Duke of New York, and this was Faces of History. If tonight cracked something open for you, share it with a friend. Subscribe, leave us a review, and keep peeling back the labels, because history isn't dead. It's carbonated, and it's waiting for you to take another sip. Good night.